Well, first of all, I want to follow my predecessors in thanking Professor Brusadelli and Professor Indracolo for organizing this spectacular event. I think the program looks just amazing and very promising. I look forward to the proceedings today and tomorrow. Also somewhat humbled to kick it off, but I'll do my best. It can only get better from here on, I would say. So what I will be presenting is something that I have been working on during the past 2 years or so. And in some ways, actually, it's very fitting that EURICS is co-sponsoring, because this was also what I was actually working on while at EURICS. It's an attempt to make sense of European adaptations of a body of literature produced at the court of Tang Emperor Taizong, or produced about the court of Tang Emperor Taizong. I would add that when I say European, I mean specifically the German and French-speaking world. It's an interesting question why this did not catch on in the same way in, say, the Dutch-speaking or the English-speaking world. I think it says something about the differences between these different European language worlds in the 18th century and perhaps later as well. Today, I will be mainly focusing on the German-speaking world, and I will be focusing on something that I've been writing about this for a global intellectual history journal. In some ways, I think you're benefiting from previous iterations of this. Some of you may have heard me talk about this last year, where I covered both the French and the German aspect. But now I'm really going to zoom into the German-speaking part, in part because what you'll see here is that these adaptations led to the construction of comprehensive models of monarchical reform, certainly focused on Europe. But the point I'm trying to make is that it's highly, or these two cases were somewhat representative, but also somewhat unusual in using or at least prioritizing also the Chinese model as in an attempt to develop a model for monarchical reform and actually broader social political reform in the French and German speaking world. Okay, so in his 1762 work on the comparative history of monarchy, Johann Gottlob von Justi dedicated an entire chapter to someone he called Taizong I. And he presented this Taizong I and his administration as a model for all rulers and monarchies across the earth. Following in von Justi's footsteps, Christoph Martin Wieland placed 2 political advice texts attributed to Emperor Taizong at the core of his utopian novel entitled Der Goldene Spiegel. For those of you who are not familiar with German, Der Goldene Spiegel means the golden mirror. He produced the first edition in 1772, and not coincidentally, after the French Revolution, he produced an updated edition in 1794. I will use throughout Der Goldene Spiegel as the title to distinguish it from the Chinese original, the Jinjing, or the golden mirror that was attributed to Emperor Taizong. Both von Justi and Wieland adapted translations of Chinese administrative texts, the Mirrors to Princes, centering on Taizong's court in particular, to develop a comprehensive vision of monarchical reform. In this presentation, I will use the work of von Justi and Wieland to set out how Enlightenment writers first of all, recognized a familiar genre in these translations of Chinese governance texts. They picked up on a set of governance manuals that had been compiled in or about the court of the 7th century consolidator of the Tang dynasty, Emperor Taizong. Now, it's important to also keep in mind that when these German thinkers were looking at these translations, they did not just see them as sort of historical material. They saw this as material that was of contemporary relevance, that was still being used at the Qing court. And they were using actually editions that were being produced in Qing China at the time. The similarity of some features of these texts to the European mirror genre facilitated cross-cultural exchange in the political, intellectual, and administrative domains. The translations of Chinese governance texts were adapted and celebrated as universal models of rulership. A set of themes from these texts was being foregrounded as general principles of government that had been derived empirically from human history, but that were also recast as practical policy for the reform of European polities. So my presentation offers an in-depth discussion of von Juste and Wieland's adaptations because they similarly created comprehensive universal models of good governance. I'm not treating the French case in part because they were also using this material, but very much to produce more ad hoc either theoretical arguments or more practical advocacy causes. And I think Federico just mentioned this already. When I use modeling in the title, I have very specific things in mind. So we'll explore to the extent possible, and I will use about 40 minutes or so. In these 40 minutes, I will explore mainly 3 dimensions of the modeling of Taizong's art of governance in 18th century Europe. First of all, a model can refer to a historical exemplar, that is, an inspiring person whose actions were suitable for imitation and whose actions were deemed to move others to similar action. So you could say in this case, Taizong himself being a model. Secondly, a model also stands for a plan that encompasses both an objective or a set of objectives and a strategy, that is, the steps that are necessary to achieve those objectives. And it's important to keep in mind that when I use model in that sense, this is not just a potential modern meaning of a model. It was also very much a 17th, 18th century understanding of what a model is. It has goals and it has a practical step-by-step plan to achieve those goals. And finally, a particular text or a genre of texts can also be conceptualized as a model. Like a historical exemplar, texts were believed to inspire readers or listeners to action. And when we're talking about action in this case, these types of action were mainly understood as serving either self-improvement, that is individual improvement, say education, but also, and very importantly, the betterment of the collective, you could say social betterment. Okay. So moving on to the next slide to give you a sense of what text we're talking about. There were roughly 3 political advice manuals or mirrors to princes that were associated with the court of Emperor Taizong. There's the Golden Mirror that supposedly he himself compiled at the very beginning of his rule. His rule roughly covers the 1620s through the 620s through the 640s, for those of you not familiar with early Tang history. Plan for an Emperor, Ti Fan, was, you could say, a testament that he left for his descendants at the end of his rule. In about 12 points, he sort of outlined what the important priorities were in being an emperor. As you could say, it's also, and Twitch had translated this as how to be an emperor. And then finally, there is a much later compilation that was done by a historian, Wu Jing, in the early 8th century. And that was entitled Zhangguan Zhengyao, or The Essentials of Governance. And indeed, as Federico also mentioned, sort of my venturing into this terrain was caused by jointly producing a translation of this last text. I think somebody still has their microphone on because we hear somebody's desk work. So if you have your microphone on, please turn it off. This, by the way, I'm also going to add a plug. This translation came out in the Cambridge text in the history of political thought, which in the past had been mainly focused on Western or European political thought. We have now, with Quentin Skinner, broadened this up to more global coverage of political thought, including also East Asia. So if you have suggestions of texts that you, or anthologies of texts that you would like to produce on the history of political thought in China, Japan, Korea, Vietnam, or whatever, please do get in touch. We are still welcoming proposals for this. Now, the important point is that in the 18th century, these 3 political advice manuals that I mentioned were described and also partially translated, partially in the case of the Essentials of Governance and Tifan, in their entirety in the case of the Golden Mirror, in a variety of European language texts. They were also available in Latin, in French, in German, in English, and in Italian. The perhaps most important text in the westward transmission of these Tang political advice manuals is the following. I won't be covering this in depth, by the way, to the sources and the frameworks that were adopted in these texts. Otherwise, we would have to be here all morning. But if you're interested, I'm certainly happy to share the longer paper. But I do want to highlight this work because it was critical in what von Juste and Wieland were able to do later on. And this is, you could say, an encyclopedia, 4-volume encyclopedia of things Chinese that was put together by the Jesuit Jean-Baptiste du Halde, based on reports, translations that he received from colleagues who were stationed in China. It's entitled Description géographique, historique, chronologique, politique et physique de l'Empire de la Chine et de la Tartarie chinoise. It was produced in Paris, the first edition at least, in 1735, but it went through many editions and also several translations. The English title, which I base on the 1741 edition produced in London, was The General History of China, containing a geographical, historical, chronological, political, and physical description of the Empire of China, Chinese Tartary, Korea, and Tibet. Now, what interests us mainly in this is that it included an anthology, a translation of an anthology that had been put together at the Kangxi court, and which included selections from the 3 manuals attributed either to Taizong or covering his court. And just to give you a quick overview here you see an example of the translation of Le Miroir d'Or, or Le Précieux Miroir, the precious mirror or the golden mirror. This was a Tinjing. Then you have Tifan, which was translated as La Règle des Souverains, or the rule or the measure of sovereigns. And then finally, of course, Jianguan Zhengyao is too big a work to be included in general, but what we see here that remonstrance letters, a genre much admired by 18th century European writers, particularly those sent in by Wei Zheng, who was sort of perhaps the most conservative, but also the most outspoken amongst Emperor Taizong's counselors. Several of those long remonstrance letters were also fully translated in this work. Here you see an example of the German translation, somewhat less readable, but all of these translations of Emperor Taizong's court were included in this edition, as they were also in an abbreviated English edition. And there you could see, so somebody looking at the table of contents would immediately say, oh, there's some mirrors here of the Chinese case to be looking at. This was not the only work in which this was covered. So here I'll sort of quickly go through some other examples. There were 2, also quite interesting, I think, 2 fairly long Tang histories that were produced in the 18th century. And both of these works also give a short account and description of these political advice manuals attributed to Taizong. And these were included in what you could say sort of journals that covered these sort of reports and information coming from various parts of the world. And I want to emphasize this point to some extent, in that typically we've seen this as sort of what then happens is that this material is used to sort of produce European fantasies and mirrors of more of the self rather than of places elsewhere. Some have made the point that particularly in the mid-18th century, there was really an emphasis on finding materials in this case, Qing China, that were current, and to produce translations of materials that were circulating in China, also to produce drawings that were based on things that were circulating in China. So I use this as an example here. There's in one of the biographies of Taizong, we find in this material, there's a picture that was clearly based also on contemporary court paintings of Tang Emperor Taizong. And we should see these translations as well, that there was really an attempt to engage with primary source material that was coming from China itself. And some of this material, also important to sort of doing in some ways what we're doing here, that is, these translations were also used to compile more universal histories and universal chronologies. So we see Taizong also appearing in more general chronologies of world history. Okay, now over to our first example, von Justi. What does he do with this? So he has access to this material. I would say that we would have to look at von Justi as exemplifying the attempt to create a model of governance based on systematic historical comparison. And in this comparison, we're going to see the Chinese case weighs more heavily than that of other cases. Very briefly, who is von Justi? I'm not going to spend too much time on this, but you should see him as someone who's probably not well known now, perhaps a little bit more in the German-speaking world, but certainly not broadly speaking in early modern history. But he's someone who in the 18th century would have gained somewhat of a reputation, mainly because he was active in 3 different worlds. He was an educator, he was active also in government, and various areas of government, and he was a very prolific publisher, publishing both journals, the work of others, but also publishing his own work. And you see here that he served at the courts of various German-speaking governments, both in Vienna, in Göttingen, in Denmark, and ultimately also at the court of Frederick II in Prussia. Here you get a sense of his output. He published over 60 works, so a lot of them were quite repetitive, but in a very broad range of fields. So quite a few of these works were translated in various languages, and he was particularly influential in the 18th century and to some extent in the 19th century for having produced for what are still being considered to be the foundational textbooks in political economy and public governance. I've put some of these titles there for those of you who are really interested in this, but I won't be covering this, except to say one thing is that he is for this reason also seen as a key figure in a school of thought that is referred to as cameralism. Some of you may be familiar with it. In case you're not, just very briefly, cameralism emerged in the 17th century German-speaking world as the theory and practice of promoting the domestic economy to increase either the royal, or in the case of these smaller German polities, ducal treasuries. By von Justi's time, cameralism had become more broadly concerned also with the improvement of, and the optimization even, of social life. That is, with theorizing what is politically and what is socially possible, and how can we then turn these plans into policy and into practice. So there's in his work, you're going to see, and I think we see this come through in the work that we'll be discussing, but also in Wieland, there's really an attempt to bring theory and practice closely together. Start with theory, but make sure that it's something that can be translated into practice. And this means that these guys are very much interested in agriculture and industry, but at the same time also in other aspects of social life, like freedom, education, public security, and so forth. And for this, they think the Chinese model is really informative. Just briefly, I think since we do have a French audience as well, you may see some resonance here with contemporary French political and economic thought, but there's a difference as well. And that is that unlike the French mercantilists or the physiocrats who were also very interested in China and based their theory heavily on the Chinese case too, cameralists saw the role of the state as neither interventionist nor laissez-faire. They saw it as sort of an automatism, a state machine that should operate smoothly, but there was a role for the state to intervene, but only when necessary, and then only to ensure domestic welfare and individual well-being. And they captured this combination of individual well-being and domestic welfare in German terms like Vollkommenheit, perfection, or Glückseligkeit, what we would translate as welfare, but it's something that was very broadly understood as covering both the individual and the collective. So getting to what von Juste was doing, it's important perhaps to mention that he not only read about China, he also had personal context. When he was in Vienna, he was in touch with a Jesuit, Franz Josef, who was collecting sort of information from colleagues who were stationed in Qing China, and in his journals he started publishing articles, for example, about personnel administration and how this had been done historically in the Chinese case. But he is unusual, I think, even in the 18th century context, in having produced this work. In 1762, he produces a book entitled The Comparisons of European with Asian and Other Supposedly Barbarian Governments. That is, de Vergleichungen der europäischen mit den asiatischen und anderen vermeintlich barbarischen Regierungen. Now, as the title subtly suggests, von Juste took aim directly at European claims of superiority. In the preface, which you see here, this is, by the way, the only edition we have at this point of this text. In this preface, he launched into an incisive critique of Eurocentrism and European acts of violence against other peoples. And as you read through the 20+ chapters, you see in the table of contents, here it becomes evident that from his perspective, in most respects, sort of covering systematically all aspects of what monarchy is, what it should be, European governance did not measure up to the standard of Thai, Peruvian, African, Persian, and especially Chinese governance. And it's important to keep in mind that at this point, 1760s, he was already facing a surge in anti-Chinese sentiment in Europe. And he also engages with this. At time and again, he notes that these people are really just vermeintlich barbarisch, that they were supposedly barbarian, not really barbarian, but that actually quite to the contrary, by investigating the administrative systems and practices of other cultures, it could be shown that it was actually the European courts and polities that in several respects failed to meet the standards of civility. Now, to von Juste, it was the Chinese arts of governance and Taizong's in particular that served as a model of how monarchical power could theoretically and practically be limited. And that was ultimately going to this model in the second sense, sort of a plan and an objective. That was for him the key question. There was in his mind no doubt that a monarchical system was, of all potential types of governance, the best system. So even though he calls this a comparison of governments, it's really a comparison of monarchies, because his premise is the monarchy is by far the best. And he gives a somewhat convoluted argument in his first chapter to explain this, but ultimately he says, we look at this historically, it's the simplest system because it mimics natural law, the father and the family, and it means that it's, when we look at European history, recent European history, it's clear that republics don't work because there's too many interests to balance. So he starts from that, but then he admits the key problem that monarchy is also a very vulnerable system because it tends to lead to abuse of power and to absolute abuse of power. The more power that's being delegated to a monarch, the more risk there is of severe abuse of power. So the key question is then for him, how have historically different polities using a monarchical system tried to limit this abuse of power, and to what extent have they succeeded? And there he says, when we look at the European case, they have not been successful. Whenever attempts have been made to do this, it has led to worse abuse. It has led to tyrants emerging. So he does not find any mechanisms that would lead to the successful limitation of absolute monarchical power in Europe. But he does derive solutions from a comparison with non-European monarchies. There he says, particularly when you look at the Chinese case, people can delegate absolute power to the ruler, but they provide him with such conditions that he, never she, and von Justy is a fairly conservative liberal thinker, also for the 18th century, he will voluntarily devote all his energy to rule wisely and to ensure the welfare of the people. The Chinese monarchy, in his view, offers the material for an analysis of the motivational drives, that is the Triebsfeder, the motivational drives that can cause a ruler to voluntarily moderate his unlimited powers. What is the plan then? So he makes the case, and then he sort of analyzes the factors that are the steps that can lead to realizing this objective of limiting absolute power. And he says that essentially that it is because they accord primacy to education, both the education of rulers, the education of princes, as well as the education in social mores of the population in general. So not just an elite, but the entire population in general. So the argument here is that education takes primacy over the law. The law is there, and actually the primacy of education is articulated in the law, in the Constitution even. Now, I want to pause for a second before I explain this, just to highlight that when he's doing this, he's positioning himself also in contrast to perhaps one of the more influential alternatives to this interpretation at the time, and that is Charles de Montesquieu's models of government. By 1748, Montesquieu had published L'Esprit des Lois, the spirit of the laws, and that was a major turning point in the interpretation of Chinese governance in Europe. Montesquieu produced a sort of schematic analysis of the ideal types of government, and for him, the Chinese monarchy represented a despotism that was governed by fear, where only one man was free. Von Justy was very familiar with this work. He had actually been on a censorship committee for the German translation of this work in 1752. He refers to the German translation Welt von der Gesetzen in his work. And it's very clear that he is engaging with the Chinese material also to produce an alternative to Montesquieu's interpretation. And I will sort of give one example here where he reproduces the remonstrance letters produced by Wei Cheng to show how, you cannot just use a couple of examples of cruelty to say, this is what the Chinese system is like. And this is, in his view, what Montesquieu is doing. He says Montesquieu has failed to understand that punishment, while it's being there and why it can be applied cruelly, it is of secondary importance in the Chinese system. The primary importance is attached to education, and this is how he uses this admonition that Wei Cheng sends into Taizong as a more theoretical answer to the question. In the interest of time, I will not cover all of the material that he adduces, but essentially what we're going to keep in mind from this is that he looks at punishment. He then looks at how the education of the prince is laid out. And this is primarily also where he uses Taizong's model of an emperor to sort of show how, in the Chinese case, they have successfully managed to do this, and that this is also what produced something that in the eyes of the Europeans was really key, why the Chinese case was interesting. It led to the continuity of the monarchy, of the Chinese system as well. There may be times when they get replaced by others, but the system has, in the interpretation of the histories that were being produced, the Chinese had been successful in continuing their system, and this education first type of governance was actually, in the eyes of von Justy, the reason for this. Now, if I were to summarize then the case of von Justy, we see that, first of all, is Taizong a model here? Yes. He also explained this on the basis of running through what were the kinds of policies that Taizong had implemented. and he devotes an entire chapter to this. Right? Taizong is the only ruler that gets this kind of attention in his comparisons. Is there an objective and a plan? Yes, the objective is limit absolute monarchical power, and there is a step-by-step plan to do this based on an education first kind of approach. And the third question is, well, are these governance texts themselves also a model for von Justi? And there's some difference of opinion. So there has been some prior work on von Justi's interpretation of Chinese materials, and some see indeed that you could see the Vergleichungen also as a kind of a mirror and a political advice manual. And I would say that not entirely, in the sense that when you read through this work for the different chapters, there's two things that are clear. First of all, this is an attempt to provide a systematic theoretical analysis of what monarchies are. And it does it all by coming up with a thesis and then sort of testing that with historical evidence. So in that sense, it's very different from mirrors to princes as we've known them in the Latin, Arabic, or Persian or Indian traditions as well. And secondly, he actually writes as a publisher, a journal publisher. Each chapter is in fact also an article that could have been published somewhere else. So he doesn't have a ruler in mind. He has actually the broad readership, elite readership that subscribes to journals in mind. So I would say that in this case, we have to see this as an early modern theoretical work, not, and in this sense, he doesn't take the Taizong manuals as his model. But that is different than in the second case. So the second case is that of Christoph Wieland. And I see him as building upon this work of von Justi. He was familiar with von Justi's work, with cameralism more broadly. But what he essentially does is to extend the Taizong model into a fictional account, into a historical utopia. And again, sort of want to give some context, the fact that he did this, that he takes sort of translated primary sources from a different place and a different time perhaps, and uses that to create a utopian model of governance, that is not unusual in the 18th century. And in fact, it's not unusual even for someone who's interested in the problem of governance and absolute monarchy, also in this case. Leading 18th century thinkers had a variety of strategies when they wanted to look critically at European governance or governance in general, and to produce a new model. One way to do things was to do what von Justi did, that is, I create a theoretical model through comparison. But another way was to write a fictional travel report from the perspective of a foreign extra-European visitor. That is to say, taking the position of somebody from a different culture and to look critically back on why is it that we do things like this in Europe, and how could we improve, that sort of thing. And actually, surprisingly perhaps, but maybe not, Montesquieu is also a good example of this. He had also written the Lettres Persanes, or the Persian letters, in 1721, where he does the same. He pretends to be sort of a Persian visiting France and asking all sorts of questions about what's happening while writing letters to an addressee. And I like this example too, in that it shows that perhaps something that's very foreign to us was very common in the 18th century, and that is to write both theoretical works and fictional works for the same goal. That this kind of a fiction was not mere fiction. It was not just literary entertainment. It was also understood to be a complementary mode of explanation and persuasion. And so you should see Wieland not as a completely different example, but very much as working in the same line as von Justi was. So what is his work? Let's take a look at it. It's here, Der Goldene Spiegel. It has actually a longer title. These longer titles were also very common in the 18th century. It's Der Goldene Spiegel oder die Könige von Tschechian, eine wahre Geschichte aus dem Tschechianischen übersetzt. That is The Golden Mirror, or The Kings of Shetiana, a True History, translated from the Shetianese language. Now, I'll give you a brief summary of what der Goldene Spiegel is, and then sort of look at the same question of what sorts of models are at work here and to what extent were they taken from Taizong's material. Something very briefly also about the author here, since I did that for von Juste, you could actually see him as a very comparable figure, active in the same three areas. He was an educator, he was active in government, and he was also a prolific publisher, journals as well as producing a variety of work himself. And he was also successful in combining these worlds. After he wrote this work, and probably he wrote this work to get a position at a court, and he was successful in getting one at the Weimar court after having done the first edition. He is somewhat better known. The main difference between him and von Juste is that Wieland has, in the German-speaking world, but actually also somewhat in the English language secondary scholarship, gotten quite a bit of attention, but then in the history of German literature, and more recently in the history of world literature, because he is supposedly the first who uses this term, Weltliteratur. It's a sort of cosmopolitan writer, and to some extent we will see this reflected in this work as well. So what is der Goldene Spiegel? There's one of these editions that also has some images that I will explain as well. Well, it recounts the history of the rulers of a small polity called Shetiana. Now, Shetiana, perhaps you can make the association yourself, is a sort of bastardization of Sichuan, because this polity is located in the southwest of China, based on sort of the provincial name of Sichuan. The story is told through a narrator, more appropriately a lecturer, who reads the history of the ups and downs of this small polity as Shetiana in a series of nightly discussions. These discussions are between this lecturer and his employers, the Persian Sultan Shah Gabal and his favorite. And the reader is told that the account of these interactions between the Sultan and his lecturer, a man called Danishmend, is possible through a series of translations. So we get the story because it was translated from the original Sichuanese to Chinese to then Latin and finally German. And this narrative framework is really important, that this idea of sort of an imperfect transmission through various kinds of translations. What that suggests is that Wieland conceived his work as a tapestry of interwoven strands that were taken from a wide range of cultural contexts that had been separated in space and time. To give you just one sense of this, we'll focus on the Chinese case, but this idea of nightly conversations, that was of course taken from the Arabian 1001 Nights. That work too had already been translated by 1717 by Antoine Galland. The name of the lecturer, Danishmend, is a Persian name, but it's also the generic name of the scholar. So you see how when he names characters, they typically stand for broader concepts taken from different cultures. And this is also the case, this is where we get to our final points. This is also the case for the two main characters whom you see here on the screen. The main character is Tifan, and his mentor is Genghis. What essentially happened, Tifan is the baby there, the baby who's being carried on the left. He was the son of the legitimate successor also to the rule of, the throne of Shetiana. But a usurper took the throne and he threatened, he set out to kill the legitimate successor, this child Tifan. Genghis, called after Genghis Khan in this case, because he already had a larger life in 18th century Europe at this time, he worked at the court of Tatiana. He saves the legitimate successor, but in doing so, he actually abandons his own child. This is the child that you see there lying on the ground. He saves Tifan, and the novel is essentially about how he then sets out to train him, educate him to become the deserving ruler of Shetiana, not only to take back the throne, but then to create the kind of state where everyone will flourish. So to not only perfect himself, but also to bring about the sort of collective welfare that cameralism was all about. And there are lots of references here to various kinds of literatures in the European context. But what I set out to do in the broader piece is to explain how this Tifan is actually an instantiation, a personification of model foreign emperor, a text that had already been known at this time. Der Goldene Spiegel itself, of course, is also taken from Jinjing, the other Taizong mirror, but surprisingly, actually, in the broad coverage of this, Tifan had not been recognized as a reference to the Taizong materials. I'm not going to set out this story, but I sort of want to say something in closing about why does it matter. Sort of we have identified this main character as being the personification of Taizong's final testament. So what does it bring about? Is there a connection between what Taizong said and what is being done here in Der Goldene Spiegel? I would say that in general, you could read this work as an additional step in the work of what von Justi had done. The objective here of modeling the Chinese art of governance in Der Goldene Spiegel is very similar to what we see in the comparisons. It's again to sort of achieve this state of perfection. And won't be able to go through the work itself, but already from the very beginning in the preface of the text, it's very clear why the Chinese model is so important. We're being told that the only reason why we can get this account of how you can train a prince, how you can ensure that he then gets to also translate this training into collective welfare is through the benefit of Chinese historiography, because they produce veritable mirrors that record history in a way that all the interactions are recorded. This comes again in the updated edition. We also learn why even the fall of Shetiana can be learned from, but again, on the basis of Chinese historiography. It starts here with a preface to Taizu, which was presumably Ming Taizu. So if we move on to a summary of, so in what sense is there a model here? It's a different kind of model, right? So it's not Taizong as a person. Tifan is a personification of his second governance manual, but at the same time, this Tifan as a character becomes sort of the exemplary ruler. So there is a person as a model. More critically, of course, is again the program, the objectives. Similarly, again, this is the limitation of absolute power, the voluntary moderation of that power in the character of Tifan, but it's something broader. So here, the education of the prince is something that is embedded in a larger constitution, where education of the larger population, but also their welfare is key. And I want to say perhaps one thing, when I use the word constitution here, we also have to read that in its 18th century context. Constitution then did not mean simply a legal text, something that we can refer to as, the legal text that gives us certain rights. No, it was something quite a bit larger. It was describing the fundamental social and political organization of a society, the mutual obligations between different social groups, and also the institutional arrangements that had historically developed to guarantee that these obligations were abided by, and that also the goal of welfare for each and all could be pursued. And it was in that sense that Wieland was talking about a Tifanese constitution, a Tifanese model, in the sense that what he was proposing is, in addition to the education of this ruler, the limitation of the powers of clerics, of the religious establishment, the recognition of the contributions that were being made by farmers, sort of giving them a better life, education, and so forth. So there was an element of social reform there, but at the same time, this came with sort of an inculcation of social mores, a sort of love of the country, and learning one's place through a broadly conceived state educational system. And this was also something that they saw as having been achieved in the Chinese case. So to conclude then the entire story, I think that will come to about just 40 minutes, what I set out for myself. We can see in the case of Wieland, this as a fairly stereotypical example of what was known in the 18th century as utopian fiction, as an archic utopian fiction, meaning not an anarchic model that exists, one where nobody was in charge, but one where sort of a model leader was in charge. What his contemporaries had done was mainly to look at classical Mediterranean examples. Télémaque by Fénelon, for example, that is, you look at the Odyssey, or you look at Egyptian models. Wieland was exceptional in prioritizing the Chinese model as a way to create a utopia that embodied both how to produce the right ruler and how to perfect society. The final part here was the text also a model? And in this case, I would say that the answer has to be clear that yes. When Wieland was producing it, it was very much produced as a mirror. He used the Chinese, the German translation of the Chinese text as his title, The Golden Mirror. And this was also a recognition that genre really mattered in telling this story for him. This had been tried in a variety of other ways, theoretical ways, but the idea of telling a novel was seen to be pedagogically also more effective, in addition to being also persuasive. So into my general conclusion, then there's a couple of points that I would like to underscore. And the first one is that the 18th century adaptations of Chinese mirror literature that I've discussed here lend support to the view, first of all, that mirrors to princes are a widely distributed and even a global administrative technology, a technology that lends itself very well to cross-cultural borrowing and adaptation. And this is, perhaps we didn't cover this so much, this is something that within the broader field, and there is such a field as the political advice literature or mirrors to princes, typically one has done, when one has been comparative, one has looked at European and to some extent sort of West Asian models, Latin and Arabic, for example. And in more recent work, one has included also Indian text to some extent. Kalila Wadimna is an important example, but that's where the line is oftentimes drawn. And perception is that what you have in East Asia is something entirely different. You have commentaries on classics, and that's how they do it. Clearly not the case. This is a global tradition. And in the 18th century, I think these texts were chosen because they were recognizable, because a conversation could be developed and it could be used and very handily by von Juste and Wieland, because they recognize it as something that was familiar enough that it was commensurable to what had been the standard practice in European monarchies. At the same time, the two cases that I discussed here were also unusual. They were unusual specifically in their prioritization of Chinese and very specifically Taizong's art of governance. In the first case, we saw how the translation of Taizong's governance text gave impetus to new and bold critiques of European governance, but also to comparative work with theoretical implications and practical consequences. Haven't talked so much about those, but there is some work that shows that actually when this material was being produced, both in Prussia, in Vienna, and also in Russia, where Catherine II was in charge, Chinese models were also being used when, for example, new ways of doing personnel administration were being developed. And that also when Katharina produced her own sort of mirror, that there too, there was a reference to the Chinese material. So there is actually also, we can point to certain things to show that this had practical effect. In the second case, we see that Wieland extended von Justi's comparative theoretical analysis of monarchies into a historical utopian novel that offered a comprehensive model for political and social reform with broad appeal, something that could also be attempted at a smaller scale, in a small polity. And I didn't mention this, why Settiana, why pick such a small polity? Well, because it showed within the context of smaller European polities that you didn't have to use China as a model. You could use how a small polity like Settiana had used the Chinese model for its own benefit, to rule a small place and to make sure that it could hold its own against a much bigger state. There is one final thing that I would like to leave you with. So is this all fantasy? Is this European fantasy about another world? Wieland's work is oftentimes read as irony as well. And there's certainly a lot of play there. And I want to leave you with this quote where he says, Stefan is not a creature of fantasy. It is critical for the entire history of humanity that he is not that. Either he has already been, or when he, and in brackets, as I think, is not among those living now, he will most surely be once in the future. And he adds later on too, that your Stefan is a rare cameralist. Now this line had been used before, and then one reads it as clearly a cameralist fantasy. But if we take the first part of the sentence seriously, your Stefan is a rare cameralist, it's also clear that from the perspective of Wieland, this Stefan, this model for an emperor, embodies the cameralist goals of collective welfare and individual improvement more perfectly than the classical European models of the past. And that was ultimately, I think, what both von Justi and Wieland set out to prove. With that, I will stop and I will leave it up. If we have some time, I think the next session will be 11:30, but we probably do want some time to pause as well, but perhaps we can take a few questions.
Thank you so much, Hilde. This wonderful journey and this analysis of a contact between, a trans-chronological, trans-linguistic contact between political models. It's very interesting. And I personally, before leaving the floor to questions, I was also very interested in your mentioning of how also the view of monarchy as the natural form of natural institutional form, and particularly its paternalistic aspect. So the monarchy as based on family resonated between these different thinkers, and I think this also opens to very interesting reflections on global paternalism, and also the fact that we tend to dismiss Chinese political thought as entirely focused on the idea of family as the model, whereas modern Europe imagined contractualism and a different view of society. But then if we look at what really happened also in Europe, we see that these models were, I mean, in dialogue, and they were resonating much more than we think. So thank you so much for your lecture. And yes, our next session is at 11:30. We might take a small break before that, but now we have time for a couple of questions. So you can raise your hands. I see David Rogac already with his raised hand. Please, David.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Hilde, for your vibrant talk and for the journey indeed throughout the centuries and various areas, geographical and philosophical. And you were talking a lot about this universal aspect of Chinese political theory, or that it was deemed universal. And also on the Chinese soil, with regard to the reception of Chinese historiography or morality, there was this common idea that the Chinese culture is universal as devoid of references to the Christian revelation. And I was wondering about how it looked like in the case of German cameralists, especially if we take into consideration the fact that at the very same time, we have a very vivid discourse about the divine right of kings. It's not a relic of Middle Ages. We have Robert Filmer and Bossuet and generally Louis XIV. So did they also value Taizong and generally these modeled idealized rulers because they just did that without the support, or did they use the Jesuit strategy, the Jesuit route, and for instance, try to show that Taizong was appointed by heaven, which is basically God? Yeah.
Yep. I'm back. Thank you for that question. So there's two answers in a way to your question, and that is that yes, for some, so the Chinese case is actually kind of brought in to prove natural law in that or a natural law based way of thinking about monarchy. The Jesuit model is very much within that framework. And the early cameralists, like Christian Wolff, pretty much adopt that as well, right? So that for them too, this it's somewhat an extension of this model by broadening it up to the Chinese case. They do see some difference as well. That there's more space for a civil way of thinking about this. So sort of, but at the same time, I would say that von Juste and Wieland are quite different from that tradition. They use it, but they don't really get into this point so much. And I think I can best illustrate this by showing the difference between somebody like Leibniz, and on the one hand, and what von Juste and Wieland are doing. Leibniz is very much interested in the metaphysical point of view as well, and he sees a corroboration for what he's developing in the Chinese case. I think you can develop that strain of thought as well, that there's an interest in Neo-Confucianism, in part because they do see this compatible with what you could say is Jesuit political thought at the time, that it is based on this natural law conception. In the case of the cameralists, you could say second generation cameralists like von Juste and then later Wieland, they're far more practical. They don't get into this at all. For them, what really matters is practical governance in the end. And this is why they're much more focused on this sort of the primacy of education and how this translates also into broader social welfare. So this theoretical elaboration of divine right doesn't really come into play that much here, which is interesting. So I think it also shows that there's different ways of working with this Jesuit material.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's what I thought, actually. Yeah, thank you.
We have time for another question, if some of you has any interest. Yes, Imke Blume-Vidar, please.
Yes, good morning. I would like to know a bit more about the importance of the translations, since you said it was all based on the translation of translations. So how much did that influence possibly the perception of China and Chinese politics and thoughts?
Thank you. Yes, it's so in some ways it builds on what I mentioned in my reply to the first question, and that is to say that when Evrouet produced the translations that were included in Jean-Baptiste Duhalde's work, he was very much working within a Jesuit state theory framework. That is to say that they saw a Confucian system that was very much compatible with the political theory that 16th, 17th century Jesuits had developed. You have a paternal figure in charge who is a benevolent kind of figure. And this means that if you look at some of the language, that certainly comes back. And it means that material gets picked up by people who in some ways either recognize that model, support it. We don't see, I think von Juste or Wieland aren't necessarily within the Jesuit frame of work. Actually, von Juste produces at some point quite a denunciation of Jesuit power at the time. But they nevertheless are able to also give it a different twist. So it's there ultimately, and I think it's worth looking at this. Some already have been working at this at the same time, and I would be inclined to read it the same way. Remember the picture that I showed, that they were using texts that were current at the court. Bertin, the French minister, I think, played an important role in really emphasizing, he sent out questionnaires, gather the material that they use, translate that. So in that sense, I think it's important that in terms of the selection, I think they were really trying to get things that were influential at the time. But in terms of, if we were to render this material now, we would use a very different set of terminologies for some of the concepts that were used. Glückseligkeit, Vollkommenheit are terms that are not used in the translation. That's important to add, perhaps, because sometimes that's the assumption might be, so are they simply then, had they translated a term that could then be used as an equivalent? So that's not the case. So the cameralists were really kind of fitting this within their own broader conceptualization of individual and social welfare. So not sure that entirely answers your question, but it may give you perhaps some idea of both the original context, but then also what the cameralists did with it.
And we have a last question from Joel Baranowski, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very stimulating lecture. I'm going to ask you a little bit of a complicated question. With respect to the model of good governance, have you encountered in any of the works of von Juste anything like an itemized list of what specific practices he would consider make for good government? And the second part of my question is, in the context of classical pre-Qin philosophy, especially Xunzi, and Xunzi, as you know, had a very profound influence on Tang Taizong's Prime Minister Wei Zheng. In Xunzi's conception of Wang Dao, he literally lists 19 elements which make up Xunzi's model of good governance. And I was wondering if you detected any of these traces in the texts that you have examined.
All right, thank you. So in terms, is there, if you're thinking of sort of a similar list, here are the 10 things that matter. No, but you could look at the table of contents, and that will give you an idea of how he works. He sees a variety of problems facing monarchies globally and universally. And then he tries to answer in each case how you can best handle this. And it's not always the case, I should add, that the Chinese governance model comes out the best. In some cases, it's the Hottentotten in Africa that have a better way of handling a succession, for example. So I think you could read the work in its entirety as a set of institutions, not just practices and institutional ways of dealing with threats that any monarchy might encounter, the monarchy still being the best system. So perhaps a convoluted answer to your question. So yes, it's there, but not as a simple list. It's but the table of contents can get you through what really matters. And he does actually what comes closest to producing a list when there's he cites the Fan, because the model for an emperor, because that does incorporate a set of 12 points. But again, then it's used actually only in one specific context. He does add other problems that monarchies face that are not included within that work. In terms of pre-Qin philosophy, does Xunzi's model come up, if I understand the question correctly? Not so much. So in von Juste, there is, again, sort of coming back to the second question, Confucius as a model, in part because of what the Jesuits had been producing about this, is certainly there. So there is a reference to Confucius, far less so to the other pre-Qin philosophers. One interesting, this is not the case for Wieland. The preface that I showed clearly shows that a concept like the laissez-faire philosophy, Wu Wei, is essentially Wu Wei. This has already been shown, and that, I think, a point worth making. I think oftentimes to our students, he does not see this as belonging to one particular school. He cites both Lao Tzu, Han Feizi, and Confucius as sort of wise examples that had advocated this sort of advice, that a ruler should not interfere. The machine should run by itself. So pre-Qin philosophy certainly comes in that sort of a reflection. But because these works are really about sort of governance in a practical sense, and historiography plays an important role, precedence is given to the kind of administrative texts that were included in Jean-Baptiste Hilde, and Taizong does get the most coverage there. The same, and I think there's another element here that plays a role, perhaps, that the guys who are writing here are not just philosophers. They want to be active in governance, and so somebody like Wei Zheng becomes a character that they want to embody. These people like von Juste and Wieland. The French case, there's actually an example where Wei Zheng is being staged as a character advocating for the cancellation of capital punishment, and another case for defending the Jesuits. So I think there's also good reason, perhaps, why pre-Qin philosophy does not get the kind of attention that perhaps it will get in the 19th, 20th century.
Okay, thank you very much. You've certainly done your homework.
And finally, Lisa, there's a question.
Yeah, I don't want to use too much time, but Hilde, thank you so much. This was really inspiring. There's a lot of food for thoughts for me later. I would just focus on something that reconnects us to what Sarah Allen will be talking later today. So the figure of the emperor as father of the people, I find it striking, and it is just perfect for somehow building a nice framework for our first day. So I just wanted to ask you, how successful was the reception of this idea, this concept of the emperor or the monarch, the ruler, as the father of the people in the West, in the Western context? Thank you.
All right. A very complicated question in some ways, right? Because how do you measure success in some ways? But if I would say, if we measure by looking at either publication or sort of adaptations of these publications and how it translates, I think, of course, in the 18th century, it's mixed. It's in the 17th century. I think this is a dominant way of talking about Chinese governance. It works. In the 18th century, I think it still works, and I think it continues to work in the 19th century. But then there's two things. First of all, there's certainly countercurrents that launch the kind of criticisms that kind of really deal a heavy blow. I've mentioned Montesquieu as the best example of this. It's simply, is not a good father. This is a despot who rules with fear, and that trend, that way of thinking, does have a large influence. I think there's some the secondary scholarship in German about the influence of Montesquieu is somewhat mixed. Some say no, it doesn't really takes a long time, but I think you see it filter through actually quite quickly. And actually, the Dutch criticisms play an important role in there as well. That they say they see different things. They arrive at the coast, and they have a different agenda, and they very much add to this as well. But perhaps what I would say in terms of there's a different way in which this is successful, not only at courts. One of the things I didn't include here, but that I will do as a final chapter in my book, is that in the 19th century, Taizong is staged as a model to the civilized youth. And sort of that behavior is also modeled as how to be a good citizen. And so that one does distill other kinds of values from this work, right? Be it, so for example, valuing history and being willing to admit one's mistakes. So there's a set of sort of practical behaviors that come out of this as well. How should one rule? But this is not just something for emperors. This is also something about, you know, how to behave well as an elite person, or as in the 20th century as a manager. So I think perhaps many of us would love that this paternalistic way of thinking perhaps is less influential, but I think it's actually far more influential, and its tentacles extend far broader than simply governance in a restricted sense.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating. I'm very much looking forward to reading your book. Thank you.